Thank you for having me. It's great to be back. I was teaching in the program for a while, and then I took, I think, something like a 10-year break. So it's really wonderful to be back and be among such great colleagues. So, wow, a lot has changed in a decade. So for the first time in terms of U.S. education history, we now have a few states in the nation where teaching Asian American studies content is actually mandated in the curriculum. This is the case in Connecticut. It's a case in, I believe, Illinois, Virginia, and they're not all the same because these are all state mandates that are a little bit different. So, which was something 10 years ago I could not have really fully imagined would be part of the political culture of the nation. And this is occurring for good and for bad. It's basically coming out of a very visible presence of anti-Asian um, hate, I guess, as folks have talked about it in the public eye. So that's led to this sort of legislative action and other forms. So what I am interested in doing for the class is to really give folks a background in Asian American history. I think even today, when I just taught my graduate course, it still continues to not really be something that many folks are exposed to. So I'm not going, so I'm going to try to go slowly, gently, and but yet move quickly when it's possible. But I think there's so many pressing issues facing our students today. I think there's so many. I can't even begin to name them all, but immigration is obviously one of them. It's something that we're seeing in the front and the headlines constantly. Every day brings something a little bit different. And I think students are probably wondering where did our current day immigration system, especially in terms of its surveillance, policing, and then incarceration, where does that all come from? And it's not something that clearly only just manifested with ICE. It has a long, deep history. And I think studying Asian American history is absolutely one of the ways we can really get into that. So in my mind, the course has really two functions. One is to really introduce people to Asian American history, and then perhaps a sort of larger, equally interesting and important question of thinking about immigration today in terms of the formation of policies, bureaucracies, etc. So let me try to share. And as a historian, we deal with many different kinds of primary sources. I'm just going to share a few of these with you all, just so that you have a sense of what we might be looking at. So, so it would make sense to think about the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act as a moment of incredible federal bureaucracy formation in terms of an immigration apparatus that the nation really didn't have prior to 1882. Um, and I would say it didn't even emerge overnight after 1882. So prior to this moment, it was the Treasury Department who that was in charge of regulating goods and people. And it's very interesting that it is the Treasury Department with customs houses, really with the intent of regulating and moving goods, and people were part of that. But with the passage of exclusion, there needed to be a way to actually administer exclusion, to really examine people, and to bar them from entry. So this is where you start to begin to have a bureaucracy. So what we're looking at right here is actually a certificate. There are not many of these kinds of certificates available for historians to look at. This is an actual return certificate that was issued to Chinese laborers who were in the United States at the time of the passage of the 1882 Exclusion Act. So this is what is happening. So policies are passed, and then the folks who have to administer it have to now actually put it into practice. They have to figure out who are they excluding, how are they excluding, and under what conditions. And one of the first questions was what to do with Chinese laborers who are coming in and out of the country. And I should say very quickly, Chinese exclusion didn't ban everyone. It focused on laborers, So folks of the laboring class, and it was initially passed for a 10-year time period. So these were the things that had folks had to contend with, but after 1888, another act was passed, the Scott Act, which basically rendered these certificates null and void. So in other words, even if a Chinese laborer got one of these before returning to China, they were not going to be acknowledged and allowed to land. So as I mentioned, Chinese Exclusion Act 1882. In 1892, Congress renewed it, and this is the Geary Act, and it added even more administrative apparatus, which was the certificate of residence. And there, the idea is that this is where we really begin to see this notion of the documented or undocumented migrant, where you're really seeing paper being produced for the purposes of distinguishing and marking who is allowed to be in the country and who is not. So the idea here is that someone entering legally into the country would have a certificate of residence. So all Chinese who were in the country at the time, if they were not, if they had entered previous to that, they would have to have had a certificate of residence, and if they were caught without it, subject to deportation. So let's see, what else do we have here? So because of this paper game that was literally being produced, you can start to see Chinese laborers and others really figuring out their ways of understanding the sort of the racist laws that were targeting Chinese, and then how to circumvent them. So part of what we're going to be looking at is how the idea of an immigration system is not a simple top-down, we instituted, everything is neatly planned out. It is almost always somewhat haphazard in terms of the way the state acts, reacts. Um, and there's some agency given to the people on the ground in terms of how to figure out and maneuver and use what some folks would call the weapons of the weak to figure out how exactly to to deal with this. And so what you're looking at here is you see the imposition of interrogations, and this is sort of a Chinese uh, document where folks are writing down the answers they gave, and then this would get handed off um, and passed on to other family members in the hopes of helping them pass through the gauntlet of immigration officials. So you're hearing basically a system that's slowly bringing in paper documentation, interrogations, and then medical inspections. So these things are all getting added in and layered as a way of policing and surveilling migrants coming in. So that's immigration. Another thing we're going to talk about is citizenship, because they're actually they're very important to think together, but historically they have actually not been as linked as one might think. So our conversations around citizenship will actually go back to 1790 in terms of Congress passing the first rule of naturalization, where you see this in yellow, where I highlighted that the criteria for citizenship in 1790 was one had to be a free white person. And this was actually a legal term that gets codified until we get into 1952. This is how late the notion of who was allowed to become a citizen stands in place. There are some changes. For example, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, we see people of African descent being added into this as an exception to the free white person's rule. But for the most part, until 1952, this is what we're looking at. And folks might be familiar with the current conversations about birthright citizenship. This was not a term that would have been heard in 1898, but certainly this is being derived out of the 14th Amendment and the really big Supreme Court case that affirmed the notion of a birthright citizenship is the Wong Kim Ark case from 1898, where a Chinese American man born in San Francisco, had to defend his citizenship right. And this is the only way people of Chinese descent or Asian descent until after 1952 could become citizens because of the 1790 rule of naturalization. That is, one had to be born on US soil to have citizenship. So the immigrant generation, the migrant generation, could not obtain citizenship through naturalization. So another thing that we'll be talking about in class is, besides thinking about Asian American history, I want to put Asian American history in relationship and conversation with other forms of exclusion and control that is happening. So some things we'll be reading will be, for example, 1924, really important moment of exclusion legislation, the Johnson-Reed Act, which redefines American immigration system in terms of instituting quotas that regulate and almost basically end um, immigration coming out of Southern and Eastern Europe in favor of Western Europe, but completely bans all Asian migration, um, is happening at the same time that you have a Citizenship Act for Native Americans, a universal act. So these moments of inclusion and of exclusion are also can be moments of inclusion. It's very complicated, and it's important to kind of think about, well, what's the relationship there? Another moment would be thinking about 1952 in terms of the McCarran-Walter Act, which is the piece of legislation that ends the free white persons clause that I mentioned. It actually is the moment we begin that ends Asian exclusion formally, though the quotas that I mentioned really briefly are still in place. So this is hardly the opening up of Asian immigration. But that said, it is definitely beginning of, it's a very controversial moment because also it stops Caribbean migration. Um, so these kinds of connections are important to think through, so that we understand how things that might seem to affect only one group can very often affect multiple groups simultaneously. So, and aside from really understanding policies, legal challenges, and those things, it's also important, I think, to understand the communities and lives of people who basically still chose to be in the United States and come and create families, communities, work, etc. So, for example, the Angel Island Immigration Station that's outside of San Francisco functioned from 1910 onward, um, until it stopped functioning as an immigration station and it became other things. Um, but really was a site of detention for many Asian migrants coming in during this period of exclusion. So literally carved on the walls of this immigration detention station is some of the poetry, and this is so scholars have collected the poetry, published it, translated it. So we'll be looking at some of that work. And then certainly we can think about exclusion and the lack of citizenship really shaping the lives of migrant communities. And in particular, Asians were pushed into certain occupations during this era, service occupations for sure. The restaurant industry, I think many of us are familiar with. So one of the things that we're also going to be looking at are Chinese menus, for example, Chinese restaurant menus to kind of get a so the reason I think something like this is useful and an interesting exercise is that I think especially for the younger grades, it can be really difficult to pick up on some of these abstract ideas and very difficult and heavy ideas of incarceration, detention, etc. But we can think about instead maybe or just as importantly, the kinds of lives that people were then circumscribed to living. So certainly, restaurant industry was a huge one. We can talk about garment work. We can talk about tenant farming as another one. There's kind of different opportunities to think about this. But there's an incredible collection of Chinese restaurant menus out there, and I've been like slowly combing my way through and downloading some of these coming from all parts of the country. I believe this one is from Utah. Yeah, Salt Lake City. What's interesting about this one, I'll just say really fast, is that you can see, or maybe you can't see because it's so small, but it's not necessarily a Chinese menu as much as it is an American diner menu. So you can see sort of folks shaping and figuring out exactly how to position themselves in the communities that they find themselves in. This is from Chicago. And here, Jimmy Wong's was apparently like the place to go. You have all these movie stars and folks stopping in. And this was quite different from the kind of diner that I just showed. And restaurants continue to be really important. And like this one is an actual restaurant that still continues to exist today. And what I like about this particular menu is that it really is it's a little Saigon, so it's a Vietnamese restaurant, but it's owned and operated by Chinese Vietnamese folks. So you can see this movement of Chinese people, for example, through refugee laws and provisions coming through. So changes there. And then I would say it's also important to think about the kind of politics of possibility in terms of what that this experience of exclusion has lent to different groups. So most recently, the pullout of Afghanistan, for example, the coming in of Afghan refugees. So it's been interesting to see Vietnamese Americans who themselves went through this, then operating in a moment of trying to parlay their own experience in terms of building solidarity, support, etc. In terms of other refugee experiences. Or this most recently, oh, this is so small, I don't even know if you can see this at all. But this was a really interesting article in the New York Times about Japanese Americans in Los Angeles out police helping to protect their communities from ICE. So these sorts of kind of moments of activism, of convergence, I think are also really interesting to consider and think about in our class. So I think I'll just end by saying my hope is that this class will be accessible to everyone, regardless of whether we're doing K through 5, 6, or high school age. I mean, my hope is there's going to be material for everyone to read and dig into, but then when it comes to really thinking about how to shape one's curricula, I'm very excited to think about the possibilities of how this can translate to a wide range of grades. Thank you.